I'm standing beside this very nice W123 station wagon. This is a 1981 300 TD, and it's got the turbocharger. This was the introduction of the turbocharger engine in the W123 chassis. Now, these cars are beloved all over the world, and the wagon is very popular. If you've watched prices on these, trying to find a nice wagon, particularly like this one, they're getting kind of expensive. But the point I want to make in this video is that it seems like all W123s suffer from one malady. I'm not sure, but I think a lot of it is just due to the fact that owners aren't aware of this, and certainly shops don't attend to the problem. But I was talking to my mechanic and I said, over the last 20 years, how many 123s have come in here and this hasn't been a problem? Anybody want to guess what it is? It seems like every one. I can't recall one that I didn't check this out and found that it had been neglected. And I'm looking at it right here. It's the water drains. The water drains underneath the hood hinge and right underneath this corner. This is what deflects all the water coming off the windshield in the front area here and out onto the ground. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's no big deal. You know, the car sits, it gets silt, plugs the holes, but it is a big deal, particularly over there, because if those holes plug up, then you're going to have rust under the battery box tray, and that rust is going to create holes, and then you're going to have water leaking into the cabin. And the same thing happens over here. If you allow that lower drain to become impacted with dirt and silt, what happens, the water rises up, stays there, gets everything wet, and it will eventually deteriorate the caulking that's applied at the factory. And I've seen water leak into the cabin right underneath this big wiring grommet here in the firewall just below the fuse box cover. So you can't neglect this. And then finally, I've probably seen 6 different 123s with broken hood hinges. They break off, they rip out of the body right here because the moisture comes up on top that pivot point on the hood hinge and eventually seizes it. So, you know, you got to take care of these drains. If you have a 123, this is something you should look at every 6 months. Not once a year, but every 6 months. Of course, if you live in the desert and there's no rain, that's probably not going to apply. But I just happened to notice this yesterday when I was working on this particular car that, wow, look at these drains. This is a perfect opportunity to show you how this can happen on a very nice car. Doesn't have to be an old beater. You'll find these drains are impacted, and in this case, it's really bad. And I think you'll find it's actually leaking through the grommet from the hood release cable, and water's going right into the cabin. Now, this happens, of course, during a heavy rainfall, but this kind of inspired me to come up with a new kit. It's going to be the W123 drain cleanout kit, because there's a couple real important things that you need to be aware of when you're cleaning these drains. And then we may even decide to pull that battery box tray out and look underneath, because I think we're probably going to find it's starting to rust underneath. And you want to stop that immediately with Miracle Paint. If you see any problem, any evidence of rust underneath the battery tray, stop it now, or you're going to have holes in your car and you're going to have very, very wet carpets. How many videos have I shown you over the past years where you got wringing out those carpets, particularly that right front one, and that's almost always due to holes that have rusted through underneath that battery box tray. And that primarily is due to plugged drains. Not always, but primarily that's the real culprit. Here you can see where I applied the Miracle Paint right in this area, and also up underneath this wiring bundle. There are about 2 or 3 spots, one right by the drain hole, that the rust had started to eat through the paint. So all those areas were coated with Miracle Paint. I roughed these up. I used the Scotch-Brite type pad on a round air grinder to really clean the rust off. When you're using Miracle Paint, you don't have to get every spot of rust off, but you want to clean all the scaly rust off. Make sure the area is thoroughly dry, and it should be at least 60 degrees when you're applying this. So this is dried overnight. I also coated the battery box with Miracle Paint because it was really rusty. So I'm going to set this down in here now, and we'll get this battery box tray bolted back in. I just saw this sitting over on my bench, and I thought I would show it to you because it does demonstrate some real unique characteristics of Miracle Paint, particularly if you're not familiar with the product or haven't used it before. Notice, number one, It does not stick to very smooth, slippery surfaces. Okay, you need to rough up the surfaces. Number 2, it will stick to anything rough, and it is so tough that after it dries overnight, you cannot even tear this apart. Try that with any other paint product. Just leave some in a can, let it dry hard, and see how easily it tears. Look at how hard it is to get it off the brush. I cannot get this one piece off the end of this brush. It is stuck permanently to the brush. The brush is worthless. It's as hard as a rock. See that? It won't even bend. This is just 12 hours. So I never use expensive brushes when I apply Miracle Paint. I use cheap brushes and throw them away. I thoroughly clean anything and everything in sight that I don't want the Miracle Paint to stick to. If you get it on your clothes, you're in trouble. You get it on your skin and leave it without wiping it off, it's going to be on there for a couple weeks. And pay attention to these particular characteristics. Don't expect that you can just stick the lid on. The lid will glue to the can, okay? We use saran wrap between the lid and the can after using Miracle Paint so that you can get the lid off. This plastic lid can even be really hard to get off. So if I'm putting Miracle Paint in small containers like this, I'll put a little piece of saran wrap over the lid, even though I'm using a plastic lid. And you think, well, that's not going to stick to it. Yes, it will stick. This is one tough product. I know if I hadn't caught this for the owner, it could have led to some really serious problems. I'm sure without me reiterating all of them, you've probably already guessed a few. Number 1, you'd have rust out holes under that battery tray, and you'd have a wet floor on the right side. You'd have water leaking into that grommet, wetting the driver's side carpet, leaking to the back below the seat. You'd have rust in the floor, rust holes in the floor. A lot of times people will wonder why these 123s get rust holes in the floors where the back seat is. They think it's leaking through the windows. No, this is the problem. It's up here in the firewall, snaking its way back. It settles on those low points where people in the rear seat put their feet, and that's where the rust holes occur. It all starts with plug drains. So these are really important. Then you could have a broken hood hinge. I've seen this numerous times where the hood hinge has literally just ripped out of this inner fender panel. And so you have hard closing hoods, other problems, and it just goes on and on and on. So how hard is it really to take care of these firewall and hood hinge drain points in the W123 chassis more than any other chassis? I think all the cars, almost all of them, need attention to the drains, but not as often as these 123s do. And I harped on this over and over again. Check those drains every 6 months, unless you have a garage queen. If it sits outside in the rain, you know, check them every 6 months. Now this came out real nice. You already got to see how nice that battery tray turned out in the area underneath it. Fortunately, the rust holes had not started in this car. If you find there's rust holes, you're going to have to use the Miracle Paint with our fiberglass cloth kit and repair that so you get a permanent seal so moisture can't creep in there. And you know, I've talked about lubrication of the hood hinges. This is exactly why you want to do this. There's a lot of moisture that gets on these hinges, so you need to lubricate the hood hinges every 6 months as well. But I just want you to take a look at this side here. Look at how clean that is now. I'd be really amazed at how much nicer this looks. Look at that. Once again, you can take it to any extreme of detail you want, but my goal was to get it really, really clean and looking kind of okay, all right? Let's just flash back momentarily and you can see a picture of how it looked before. But after cleaning all that, scrubbing that all out, poking, brushing, you know, this really looks nice. Now look over there on the right side, how that turned out as well. I think the owner is real fortunate here that he doesn't have more rust there. And then I'm going to roll up over and get in the trough under the hood hinge. And you can see once again just how clean that is all the way going to the back. Even after having done the battery box tray, we were able to get the drains all clean and flowing freely. And then look at what I found underneath the car on both sides, right behind the front tires. That was all junk, by the way, that came out of the drains. You can see, you don't want to neglect these drains. And during this whole process, I thought, you know, there's a certain way you should do this. You don't want to scratch the metal, you don't want to scratch the paint when you're cleaning and scrubbing all these drains. So I came up with a kit. You see it right here. It's going to include a bunch of different brushes, and we've got some special lubricant for the hinges and a syringe. This is the same lubricant that comes in my lube kit. It's a real heavy, thick synthetic oil. And a curved tip syringe. I go through the video instructions that come with this kit on how to lubricate the hinges and how to use all these brushes and what you have to do to make sure it gets all cleaned out, particularly underneath the fender well here. You do not want to use metal. Don't start poking around with some metal object trying to clean out those drain holes, or you'll start rust spots, and you know what happens when rust starts. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. Of course, you could probably make something like this yourself, but some of these brushes are kind of special, particularly these round ones, which will allow you to get down and clean those holes deeply into those holes, particular ones right by the firewall, without scratching the paint. I'll put a link in the show more part of the description below. That'll take you right to all this information on my website.